Hello everyone, and welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we bring you 7 deeply disturbing, true cemetery horror stories that will make you question what truly rests beneath the ground in America's oldest burial grounds. These are not fictional tales, but real encounters verified through death records, genealogical research, cemetery maintenance logs, and direct witness accounts. Each narrative has been carefully documented and cross-referenced with historical archives to ensure authenticity. The graves hold secrets that most people will never uncover, and perhaps that is for the best. The cemeteries we explore tonight contain evidence of unsolved crimes, inexplicable phenomena, and truths that the living were never meant to discover. If you want to hear authentic horror content drawn from verified historical sources that will keep you awake long into the night, subscribe to Buried Files and hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest investigations into the unexplained and the buried. After you listen to these disturbing accounts, we want to hear from you in the comments below about your own encounters with the mysterious or the unexplained. We want to know if you have experienced something that defied explanation at a cemetery or burial ground near you. Now settle in as the night grows darker and we begin to unearth the stories that have been hidden beneath the soil for decades, some for centuries. Let us reveal what the graves have kept silent. The autumn air carried a chill that seemed to penetrate deeper than the temperature suggested. Hunter stood at the entrance of Meadowbrook Cemetery just before midnight, metal detector in hand, flashlight mounted on his shoulder. The device felt heavier than it had in his driveway, as though the weight of what he was about to do had transferred itself into his grip. He had promised his friend Sarah that he would find her grandmother's heirloom bracelet, lost somewhere in this sprawling cemetery over 30 years ago. It was a simple enough request, one that should have taken an evening and nothing more. Hunter did not know then that this night would unearth something far more valuable and far more terrible than any family keepsake. Meadowbrook Cemetery stretched across 40 acres of rolling terrain just outside the city limits. The oldest graves dated back to the 1800s, their headstones tilted at odd angles by decades of frost heave and soil settling. The newer sections, where Sarah's grandmother had been buried in 1993, were maintained with more precision. The grass was trimmed regularly, the walkways lined with concrete, and the graves arranged in neat rows that made navigation logical and methodical. Hunter had visited the cemetery twice before, both times during daylight hours to get his bearings and confirm the burial location. He had walked past the older sections, noticing how different they felt from the modern plots. There was something almost accusatory about those ancient markers, as though they were monuments to secrets kept and stories never told. Tonight, however, the place felt completely different. The darkness transformed it from a place of remembrance into something older and stranger, a landscape of shadows and silence where the living felt distinctly unwelcome. The trees cast shapes that seemed to move independently of the wind. The grass beneath Hunter's feet felt springy and unfamiliar, as though the earth itself was responding to his presence. He had brought provisions for a long night, a thermos of black coffee, extra batteries for his flashlight, a small camping lantern that he set up at his base location near the cemetery's administrative building. The lantern cast a warm circle of light that made the surrounding darkness feel even more absolute. Hunter activated his metal detector and began his systematic search. He had marked off a grid on his phone's GPS, calculating that the bracelet would likely be found within a 20-foot radius of Sarah's grandmother's grave. The metal detector was a quality model, the kind used by serious hobbyists and professionals, sensitive enough to detect even small metal objects buried several inches beneath the surface. The device required calibration to account for the natural mineralization of the soil. and Hunter had spent considerable time preparing before arriving at the cemetery. As he swept the device back and forth, the detector remained quiet. He moved methodically through his grid, checking his phone's grid map every few minutes to ensure he was not overlapping his search patterns. An hour passed, then 2. Still nothing but the ambient electrical hum of the detector and the occasional false positive from scattered metal debris too deep to retrieve. The night grew colder as he worked. Hunter had worn a heavy jacket, but the damp chill that seemed to rise from the earth penetrated the fabric. He took breaks every 30 minutes, returning to his lantern for coffee and to warm his hands. He could see his breath in the beam of his flashlight. He wondered if other people ever visited the cemetery at night. If there was something about this place that called to those seeking solitude or escape. He thought about the people buried beneath his feet. Hundreds of them. Some whose names he recognized from the headstones, most who were complete strangers. The anonymity of the dead was strangely comforting. They could not judge him for his trespassing. They could not care that he was here. It was nearly 2 in the morning when the detector produced a sound different from the others. This was not the low buzz of shallow metal or the irregular bleeding of electrical interference. This was a sustained, urgent wail that made Hunter's stomach tighten and his heart rate accelerate immediately. He had been searching for hours without success, and this sound, finally, promised something tangible. He marked the location on his GPS with precision, then carefully set down his detector and retrieved his shovel. The ground was soft here, unusually soft for late autumn. In fact, as Hunter drove his shovel deeper, he realized that the earth here seemed to have been disturbed relatively recently. The soil was darker than the surrounding patches, looser, lacking the compacted density of ground undisturbed for decades. The displaced earth seemed almost to mock the careful maintenance that the cemetery staff applied elsewhere. His shovel struck something solid, a resistance that was unmistakable. What Hunter found was not a bracelet. The first thing his light illuminated was bone, not scattered fragments or weathered pieces, but a complete human skull, still bearing traces of matted hair and desiccated flesh that clung to the bone like ancient parchment. Hunter dropped his shovel and stumbled backward, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The oxygen seemed to drain from the night air. He stood for a full minute, simply breathing, controlling the urge to vomit that rose in his throat. Then, gathering his courage, he activated his phone's flashlight and looked more carefully. The skeleton was articulated, meaning the bones had remained in anatomical position, suggesting the body had decomposed in place over many years. The clothing, though deteriorated, suggested an era from the 1980s or early 1990s. But this was not Sarah's grandmother. Hunter knew this because he could see the grave marker 15 feet away, her name and dates clearly visible in the beam of his flashlight. This was a different burial altogether. This was clandestine. This was wrong in every possible way. Hunter called the police at 2:47 a.m., though he would not remember the exact time until much later when reviewing the case file. He reported the discovery with trembling voice and provided the cemetery location with precision, reading coordinates directly from his phone's GPS application. The dispatcher assured him that officers would arrive within 15 minutes and instructed him to remain at the scene and not disturb anything further. Hunter put down his phone and sat on the ground near his metal detector, keeping his distance from the shallow grave. He felt a profound sense of exposure, as though by uncovering the grave, he had exposed himself to something ancient and hostile. He sat there in silence for what felt like hours, watching the grave, half expecting something impossible to happen. The next 4 hours were among the longest of his life. Police arrived first. 2 officers in a patrol car who secured the scene with yellow tape and cordoned off a perimeter. Then came the forensic specialists in a white van, unloading equipment and cameras with methodical efficiency. Photographs were taken from multiple angles. Evidence was collected in labeled bags. The soil was carefully screened to recover any artifacts or fragments. The skeleton was photographed in situ before being carefully excavated and placed in a body bag. Hunter watched from a distance, separated from the grave by the yellow tape barrier. He gave his initial statement to a detective, describing what had happened and why he was searching the cemetery at night. The dental records of the skeleton were pulled and cross-referenced by morning. The identity emerged within 6 hours of police involvement. The remains belonged to a man named Marcus Chen, reported missing in 1989. He had been a patient at a private medical facility located adjacent to Meadowbrook Cemetery, a psychiatric hospital that had operated since the 1960s and had closed in 2001. According to official records, Marcus Chen had died at the facility and been properly buried in Meadowbrook's medical section with appropriate documentation and death certificates filed with the county. Except those records were false. Marcus Chen was buried not in the medical section, which was carefully maintained and monitored by administrators, but in the older sections of the cemetery, in an unmarked grave located deliberately in the middle of a family burial plot, obscured by the legitimate graves surrounding it. The investigation that followed revealed much about institutional corruption and deliberate deception. The groundskeeper at Meadowbrook during that period, a man named Joseph Hartwick, had maintained his position for 32 years, serving under 4 different cemetery directors. When confronted with the evidence during an interrogation that lasted 16 hours, Hartwick initially denied everything. But the forensic evidence was overwhelming and incontrovertible. The shovel marks around Marcus Chen's grave matched shovels kept in the groundskeeper's shed, the patterns and dimensions identical under expert analysis. Soil samples from the grave matched the earth displaced by Hartwick's tools, the mineral composition and clay content providing definitive confirmation. Most damning of all, medical records from the psychiatric hospital revealed that Marcus Chen had been reported as alive by hospital staff for 3 months after his actual death. During those months, his family had received forged correspondence indicating their son was improving. They had even been sent a fabricated photograph of him attending an art therapy session. The truth was more sinister than anyone anticipated. Marcus Chen had been murdered at the hospital, his body disposed of rather than processed through official channels. The details of how and why remain officially classified, sealed by court order at the federal level. Joseph Hartwick had accessed the hospital morgue using his connections as the longtime groundskeeper, a position that gave him unusual privileges and access to the facility's operations. He had moved the body from the hospital morgue and buried it in Meadowbrook Cemetery in the middle of the night, using his master keys and knowledge of the grounds to avoid detection. For 3 decades, he had maintained that grave, raking over it carefully, replanting grass seed, ensuring nothing drew attention from the cemetery's visitors or administrators. The forged documentation and false reports from the hospital staff suggested a conspiracy larger than one man, involving multiple people within the institution's hierarchy. But Hartwick never named his accomplices. He died in prison in 2019 at 74 years old, taking whatever else he knew to his grave. His death felt like closure to some, but to investigators, it felt like the completion of a cover-up that had begun decades before. Hunter never did find Sarah's grandmother's bracelet. He stopped searching after Marcus Chen's remains were recovered, and the investigation began. The metal detector was put away in his garage, never to be used again. When Hunter thinks about that night, which he does frequently though he prefers not to discuss it, He wonders about the implications of what he discovered. If he had searched in a slightly different location, if he had chosen a different night, if Sarah had not asked him for help, would Marcus Chen still be unidentified? Would Joseph Hartwick have continued his work in secret for the remainder of his life? How many other unmarked graves might exist in Meadowbrook Cemetery and other cemeteries, hidden beneath the grass and carefully tended flower beds? The cemetery conducted a comprehensive internal audit following the discovery. They found 7 more graves that were undocumented in the official records, buried in the physical landscape, but never officially marked or registered in the master plot maps. 5 of these graves contained remains that were eventually identified through DNA analysis and dental records comparison. 2 graves contained no remains at all, only empty soil, suggesting bodies had been removed at some point in the past for unknown reasons. The cemetery issued a formal public apology and implemented new security protocols, including surveillance cameras and mandatory background checks for all staff members. A memorial was erected for the victims discovered, though their names could not all be determined with certainty. The hospital was demolished in 2005, its records sealed, its history buried beneath concrete. Sarah eventually found her grandmother's bracelet 3 months later at an antique shop in the city center. A woman had donated it along with vintage jewelry. Sarah purchased it for $200, a fraction of its actual value. She never wore it. The bracelet now sits in a drawer in her bedroom, and she has never told Hunter that she found it. Meadowbrook Cemetery continues to operate today. Families still bury their loved ones there. Visitors still tend the graves and leave flowers. But something has changed in the atmosphere of the place. Hunter knows that beneath the carefully maintained lawns and respectful silence, anything is possible. Any truth, no matter how long buried, can be unearthed. Brooklyn had inherited more than just a family plot when her grandmother passed away. She had inherited an obligation, a ritual that had persisted through 3 generations. Every Saturday morning, without exception, Brooklyn would arrive at Grandview Memorial Cemetery with a bucket of water, pruning shears, and fresh flowers. The cemetery was her sanctuary in those early hours before the city awakened, a place where she could think and remember while caring for the small rectangular grave marked with her grandmother's name and the dates that defined her life. This responsibility had been passed to her without question, as though she had no choice in the matter, as though the care of the dead was simply part of her birthright as a woman in her family. Grandview Memorial was one of the oldest cemeteries in the state, established in 1847 on a rolling hillside overlooking the valley. The grounds had been meticulously maintained for over a century and a half, with mature oak trees providing shade to thousands of graves. The pathways were lined with granite markers and carefully trimmed shrubs. The cemetery had a hierarchy of sections, each designated by letter and number, indicating when plots had been purchased and the approximate era in which they would be used. Brooklyn had memorized the layout of Grandview years ago. She could navigate the grounds in darkness if necessary, could find her grandmother's grave without consulting a map. She had walked these grounds since childhood, attending funerals and remembrance ceremonies, learning the geography of death as though it were as familiar as her own home. For the first 3 years after her grandmother's death, Brooklyn maintained her Saturday routine without incident. She would arrive early, usually around 6 in the morning, when the cemetery was nearly empty except for occasional groundskeepers preparing the day's maintenance. She would spend an hour tending to her grandmother's grave, removing dead flowers, pulling weeds, watering the grass, and sometimes simply sitting on the bench nearby, speaking to the carved name as though her grandmother could hear every word. This was her meditation, her way of maintaining connection to someone who had shaped her childhood and taught her the importance of honoring those who had come before. She felt no embarrassment in speaking to her grandmother. The cemetery was a place of solitude, and the dead deserved courtesy. On a Saturday in late April, Brooklyn noticed something unusual. She had completed her routine at her grandmother's grave and was walking back toward the main gates when she passed through a section of the cemetery she had never paid particular attention to before. This section, marked as Area 12 on the cemetery map, seemed different from the rest. The graves were arranged in perfectly uniform rows, each plot marked with a small concrete square flush with the ground. But there were no headstones, no names, no dates, no inscriptions of any kind. The section stretched across what Brooklyn estimated to be 2 acres, containing at least 40 graves, all of them completely unmarked. The concrete markers were the only indication that anyone was buried beneath the earth. Brooklyn stopped walking and stood in the middle of the section, turning slowly to take in the full scope of what she was seeing. The concrete squares were weathered, suggesting they had been in place for decades, but their surfaces were blank. Some showed cracks from age and freeze-thaw cycles. Moss grew on the shaded squares near the trees, but none bore any information that would indicate who lay beneath them. Brooklyn felt an immediate sense of wrongness, as though she had stumbled upon something that had been deliberately hidden from view. She counted the visible graves carefully, moving methodically through the section, marking her observations in her notebook. 43 unmarked plots in the middle of one of the state's most prestigious cemeteries. 43 people whose names and identities had been erased from public memory. She did not mention the discovery to anyone that week. Instead, she spent her evenings researching, accessing the cemetery's public records online, searching for archived maps, looking through historical documents at the local library. She contacted the cemetery's administrative office and requested information about Area 12, but was given only vague explanations about record-keeping practices. When she returned to Grandview Memorial the following Saturday, Brooklyn brought a notebook and began systematically documenting the section. She photographed each grave, noting its position, the condition of the marker, and any distinguishing features that might prove relevant to her investigation. She spoke to the groundskeeper, an older man named Frank, who had worked at Grandview for nearly 40 years. Frank's reaction was immediate and concerning. When Brooklyn asked about Area 12 and the unmarked graves, his demeanor changed noticeably. His jaw tightened. His eyes shifted away from her gaze. He became evasive, suggesting she focus on her own family plot and not concern herself with other sections of the cemetery. His voice became quieter, as though he was afraid of being overheard, even though they stood alone among the graves. When she persisted, asking specific questions about who was buried there and why there were no markers, Frank became almost hostile. He told her in a low voice that some questions were not meant to be asked, that certain sections of the cemetery predated current record-keeping practices, and that she would be wise to forget she had ever seen Area 12. The intensity of his warning frightened her more than any answer he could provide. That conversation stayed with Brooklyn for months. The groundskeeper's reaction had confirmed her instinct that something was genuinely wrong, something deliberately concealed. She visited the local historical society and met with an archivist named Dr. Patricia Morrison, a woman in her 70s who had spent her entire career documenting cemetery history and genealogical records. Dr. Morrison had spent decades researching the darker aspects of cemetery management and institutional burial practices. When Brooklyn described what she had found, Dr. Morrison's expression grew serious and thoughtful. She disappeared into the archives and returned 30 minutes later carrying a large leather-bound ledger and several black and white photographs. The photographs showed Grandview Memorial from approximately the 1950s. In these images, Area 12 was clearly visible, and the graves were marked with actual headstones. The headstones bore names and dates. They looked like any other cemetery section, yet the names were unusual. Many appeared to be marked simply with single names: unnamed female, infant, unknown male, no identification. The dates ranged from 1935 to 1962. Some headstones were so weathered that the names were barely legible. Dr. Morrison explained that she had discovered documentation indicating this section had been significantly altered in the early 1970s. During the mid-20th century, Grandview Memorial had received significant numbers of bodies from psychiatric institutions, county hospitals, and poor houses. These were individuals who had died without family to claim them, without resources to pay for burial, without documented identities. The cemetery had buried them in Area 12, marking each grave with a headstone bearing whatever minimal information was available. However, sometime in the early 1970s, the decision had been made to remove all headstones and replace them with simple concrete markers. The official explanation in the cemetery records was that the markers were being upgraded and modernized. The truth, according to Dr. Morrison's theory based on years of research, was that the headstones had become an embarrassment to the cemetery and community. Anonymous graves are less visible. Unmarked graves are easier to ignore. Brooklyn spent the next 2 years investigating the history of Area 12 with increasing intensity. She filed public records requests, submitted genealogical queries to ancestry websites, contacted descendant organizations, and corresponded with historians specializing in cemetery preservation and institutional history. What emerged was a complex and troubling picture. The approximately 45 individuals buried in Area 12 had been transferred from a state psychiatric facility that had closed in 1965. Among them were individuals who had been institutionalized for decades, some since childhood. Many had family members who had never been notified of their deaths. Some had been buried under assumed names because their true identities had been lost in institutional records. A few had been transferred to the cemetery within days of admission, suggesting causes of death that had perhaps not been thoroughly investigated or properly documented. The most disturbing discovery came when Brooklyn located archived newspaper articles from 1963 and 1964. An investigative reporter named James Whitmore had written a 3-part series about conditions at the State Psychiatric Hospital, located only 3 miles from Grandview Memorial. The articles described overcrowding, insufficient medical care, physical abuse of patients, and an unusually high mortality rate among institutionalized individuals. The reporter had attempted to follow up on the story, but subsequent articles were never published. The newspaper's editors had declined to continue the investigation. The reporter left the newspaper 6 months later and moved out of state. His later work focused on entirely different subjects, as though he had been discouraged from pursuing investigations into institutional abuse. Brooklyn decided to act despite the risks she sensed. She contacted the cemetery director, a woman named Helen Ashford, and requested a formal meeting to discuss the history and status of Area 12. The meeting was tense and uncomfortable from the beginning. Ms. Ashford acknowledged that Area 12 contained unmarked graves from the mid-20th century, but insisted the cemetery had followed all applicable regulations and procedures. She stated that headstones had been removed due to vandalism and defacement, not for aesthetic reasons or to conceal the graves. When Brooklyn suggested the graves should be properly marked and documented, Ms. Ashford became dismissive, saying such an undertaking would be expensive, time-consuming, and would require significant research. But Brooklyn would not be discouraged. She reached out to local historical societies, preservation organizations, and genealogical groups throughout the state. She gave presentations about the unmarked graves, presented her documentation to community organizations, and published an article in the Regional History Journal that garnered significant attention. She discovered she was not the only person searching for relatives in Area 12. She made contact with 7 different families who had relatives buried there, individuals whose deaths had been largely forgotten, but whose absence had never been forgotten by their families. The pressure built gradually but steadily. The newspaper, prompted by Brooklyn's research and persistence, ran a historical feature about forgotten graves. Local historical organizations declared Area 12 a matter of community concern. Families requested assistance in properly memorializing their relatives. And then, unexpectedly, things changed significantly. After 3 years of resistance, the cemetery announced a restoration project for Area 12. They would conduct research to identify the individuals buried there, commission new headstones with proper names and dates, and create a dedicated memorial section honoring those whose deaths had gone unremarked for so long. The project would take 2 years and cost over $70,000. The funding would come from cemetery resources, grants from historical preservation organizations, and donations from families seeking to memorialize their relatives. Brooklyn attended the dedication ceremony when the project was completed. On a warm autumn day, approximately 50 headstones were unveiled in Area 12. Each bore a name, birth, and death dates, and often a simple inscription reflecting the lives of those buried beneath. The ceremony included remarks from family members who had traveled significant distances, prayers from a local minister, and acknowledgement of the oversight and neglect these individuals had endured. Brooklyn stood among the crowd and felt the profound weight of what she had accomplished through her persistence. Several times during her work on the project, Brooklyn had visited Area 12 at night. She had sat among the graves, reading the names of those who had been forgotten, listening to the silence of the cemetery at midnight. She had felt a presence, a collective acknowledgement emanating from beneath the earth. Years later, when Brooklyn visited Grandview Memorial on her Saturday mornings, she would walk through Area 12 and read the names aloud. She would place flowers at several graves. The dead, she had learned, should never be forgotten. Some graves demand more than respect. Some graves demand that the truth of what was buried beneath them finally be told. Jonathan had spent his entire adult life avoiding cemeteries with deliberate precision. He had witnessed enough death in his childhood through his grandmother's illness to develop a visceral aversion to graveyards and the places where the dead were interred. His strategy had always been simple: take longer routes to his destinations, drive around cemetery properties, and under no circumstances cut through burial grounds, regardless of how convenient the shortcut might be. This avoidance had persisted for 34 years without incident or temptation of any kind. On a Tuesday evening in October, his resolve would be tested by nothing more than convenience and poor planning on an otherwise ordinary day. It was dusk when Jonathan realized he had taken a wrong turn leaving work. The sun hung low in the western sky, painting the clouds in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. He was due to pick up his daughter from soccer practice in 12 minutes, and the indirect route through residential streets would add at least 8 minutes to his drive time. He could cut through Hillside Cemetery, a sprawling burial ground that occupied approximately 30 acres of land between his workplace and his daughter's school. The cemetery had always existed on the edge of his perception, a place he acknowledged but never visited or truly looked at. Now, pressed for time, he found himself reconsidering his long-established avoidance. Jonathan pulled into the cemetery's main entrance, following the narrow asphalt road that curved between the grave markers. He told himself he would drive straight through, avoiding any moment of hesitation or discomfort. The road forked ahead, and he took what appeared to be the more direct path. winding between sections marked with small plaques indicating the family names interred there. He passed administrative buildings and a small chapel from the 1920s, its stone facade weathered by decades of rain and frost. The trees here were old, their branches creating a canopy that filtered the fading daylight into a soft, diffused glow that seemed to slow time itself. Jonathan checked his clock carefully. He had made good time. His daughter would barely notice he was cutting it close, and he would avoid the guilt that came from making her wait outside in the cold. He pressed the accelerator slightly, eager to exit the cemetery and complete the normal remainder of his evening routine. It was then that he heard it. A sound that made him immediately take his foot off the accelerator and brake carefully to a stop. The sound seemed impossible, but it was unmistakable. It was laughter. Not the laughter of an adult, but distinctly the laughter of a child. Playful laughter, the kind of sound a young child makes when engaged in a game or experiencing genuine joy. The laughter seemed to echo across the cemetery grounds, carrying through the quiet evening air with ethereal, impossible clarity that made Jonathan's skin prickle with inexplicable dread. Jonathan rolled down his window and listened more carefully, hoping to determine the source of the sound. The laughter continued, playful and innocent, but utterly impossible given that he was alone in a cemetery at dusk, surrounded only by graves and monuments. Jonathan pressed the accelerator again, telling himself that the sound must be from a neighboring area, perhaps children playing in a nearby park or residential neighborhood adjacent to the cemetery grounds. The sound of his car engine and tires on asphalt should have drowned out any external noise. Yet the laughter remained audible, persistent and clear. It seemed to follow the direction of his vehicle, always close by, always at the edge of his perception, but never quite locatable or identifiable. Something about the laughter felt deliberate, as though it was waiting for him specifically. He followed the winding road deeper into the cemetery, away from the main entrance. The rational part of his mind understood that he had become disoriented, that he was no longer moving toward the exit, but rather moving deeper into the cemetery's interior. Yet something compelled him to continue following the sound. The laughter had become almost hypnotic, a siren call that his conscious mind resisted, but his body obeyed without question. The light was fading rapidly now. The sun had dropped below the horizon, and the sky had transformed from purple to deep blue to near black, as though darkness was descending faster than the normal progression of evening. He turned on his headlights. The cemetery was different now in ways he could not articulate. The grave markers seemed to multiply in the darkness, white stones catching the beams of his headlights like watchful eyes observing his movement through their space. The trees had become twisted silhouettes, their branches reaching toward him in accusatory gestures that seemed almost animated. The laughter continued, no longer echoing but present, immediate, surrounding him from multiple directions simultaneously, as though the entire cemetery had learned to speak in the voice of a child. Jonathan realized with a jolt of fear that he had stopped his car without fully being aware of having done so. He sat in the darkness of his vehicle, listening intently. The laughter had changed somehow in character and texture. It was still playful, still innocent, but there was now an undertone of something else beneath the surface. Persistence. Insistence. A quality that suggested the laughter was not mere sound, but a form of communication, a deliberate attempt to draw him somewhere specific. Against every instinct that screamed at him to flee, Jonathan got out of his car, leaving the engine running and the headlights burning. The cemetery air was cold, much colder than it had been just minutes before, as though temperature itself responded to the presence of the laughter. His breath became visible, in small clouds, as he stepped away from the protection of his vehicle. The laughter continued, and now Jonathan could determine a rough direction with increasing certainty. It seemed to originate from somewhere northeast of his position, deeper into the older sections, where the grave markers were small and close together, packed densely to contain as many brief lives as possible. The section for children, he realized with growing certainty. A dedicated section for infant burials and child graves, marked with small stones and often decorated with toys and flowers left by grieving parents. Jonathan walked toward the laughter, aware on some level that he was making a terrible mistake, but incapable of stopping himself. The grass was wet from recent rain, soaking through his work shoes and dress pants, moisture seeping into his socks. Grave markers caught his feet repeatedly, nearly tripping him multiple times as he navigated through the darkness. The laughter grew louder as he approached the children's section, becoming almost manic in intensity, shifting from playful to something more desperate and urgent. And then, abruptly, it stopped completely. Jonathan stood in absolute silence. The laughter had ceased entirely, leaving only the sound of his own rapid breathing and distant hum of traffic beyond the cemetery walls. He stood in the middle of the children's section, surrounded by small stones and weather-beaten markers that had endured decades of weathering and neglect. In the beam of his phone's flashlight, he read names on the nearest markers. Sarah Chen, 1903-1907. Thomas Mitchell, 1925 to 1926. Mary Louise Garrett, 1910-1911. Children, dozens of children, buried here over a century, their brief lives marked by small rectangles of stone meant to testify to their existence. Jonathan turned in a complete circle, surveying the graves around him with growing horror and fascination. And it was then that the laughter began again. But this time it came from a different source entirely. It seemed to emanate from beneath his feet, rising from the ground itself, coming from beneath the earth where these children had been buried more than 100 years ago. The laughter now had a desperate quality to it, a hunger that had been waiting more than a century for someone to finally acknowledge its presence. Jonathan stumbled backward, his rational mind completely overwhelmed by the impossible reality he was experiencing. He ran, his careful, deliberate movements abandoned in favor of pure survival instinct. He crashed through the darkness, his phone's flashlight bouncing wildly, illuminating fragments of gravestones and churned earth. The laughter pursued him, seeming to come from every direction, as though the entire cemetery had begun laughing at once. A chorus of children's voices crying out simultaneously. He burst from the children's section and found himself on the cemetery road. His car was still there, waiting with its headlights burning like eyes in the darkness. Jonathan dove into the driver's seat and started the engine without closing the door. He accelerated rapidly along the winding road, his hands shaking so badly that he could barely maintain control. The laughter followed him, but gradually it faded as he approached the main entrance. By the time he passed through the cemetery gates onto the public road, the sound had vanished entirely, replaced only by his engine roar and pounding heart. He was 7 minutes late picking up his daughter. She complained for 45 seconds about waiting in the cold, then was occupied with talking about her day and friends. Jonathan drove on autopilot, responding with vague acknowledgments while his mind remained trapped in the cemetery. Jonathan researched Hillside Cemetery the following morning. He found archives and historical records. The cemetery had experienced significant increase in burials during the 1920s, coinciding with an influenza outbreak. Dozens of children had died and were buried in the section he had stumbled upon. Some graves were unmarked, the children's identities lost to time. Among the documented deaths was a specific tragedy. On October 15, 1922, a fire in a local orphanage claimed the lives of 15 children. All 15 were buried in Hillside Cemetery in a mass grave. The fire was officially attributed to faulty wiring, but investigation was limited. Jonathan never returned to Hillside Cemetery. He added extra minutes to his commute rather than risk cutting through again. But he would not forget what he had heard. Late at night sometimes, when he was alone in his house, he could swear he heard the echo of that laughter. Other people had heard the laughter too. Jonathan discovered through online paranormal forums that multiple individuals over several decades had reported identical experiences. The sound of children laughing, always at dusk, always leading people deeper into the cemetery, always ceasing when witnesses reached the children's section. Some described it as playful, others as desperate. A few described it as hungry, a trap set by entities desperate to communicate with the living and be acknowledged by the world above. Jonathan sometimes wondered if his willingness to listen had satisfied whatever presence inhabited that place. He wondered if the laughter had been reaching out to countless people for decades, finally finding someone willing to pay attention. He wondered if by bearing witness and conducting research, he had somehow honored those children who had died so long ago, restoring their memory to the world. What Jonathan could not explain was why, on certain autumn evenings when the sun hung low and the air grew cold, he swore he could still hear that laughter, not pursuing anymore, but accompanying him. A ghostly reminder that some places hold memories that refuse to be forgotten, and that sometimes the dead cry out in the only way they can, waiting for someone living to finally acknowledge that they had lived, had mattered, and had deserved to live longer than they did. Skylar never considered herself superstitious. As a graduate student in anthropology, she sought answers in the quantifiable details of bone, soil, and stone. Her approach to life, like her approach to research, was defined by evidence and the slow perseverance of observation. Yet even the most rational mind can be disturbed by the weight of old places and older secrets. And on a luminous August afternoon, Skylar would find herself questioning everything she thought she knew about history, fear, and the power lingering beneath the surface of the earth. The Blackwood Cemetery lay in a forgotten corner of a rural township, hidden by a dense overgrowth of maples and towering black oaks. It was one of the state's oldest graveyards, established in 1774 and the resting place of settlers, soldiers, and those for whom no one remained to tend or weep. Skylar had come to Blackwood in pursuit of a thesis topic, armed with a field journal, camera, and an affinity for forgotten things. She was supposed to document burial customs from early American settlements and compare them to modern practices. Her advisor had encouraged the project, believing that rural cemeteries, untainted by urban renewal, would yield fascinating insights into the evolution of ritual and memorial. The gate into Blackwood was half collapsed, iron splinters in the bramble. Skylar slipped inside, pausing to adjust to the change in air, a stillness deeper than any absence of sound. The grass, tall and wild, brushed her thighs as she moved up the main path. The stones sat at odd and ancient tilts, names worn away by centuries of rain and lichen. The modern cemetery, she thought, was nothing like this. She felt, for the first time, as though she was trespassing not merely on property, but in time itself. She began her documentation at the southern edge, photographing each stone, making rubbings, sketching the oddities she found. Graves marked with willow trees, Greek columns, obelisks leaning drunkenly in the dusk. The air held the scent of loam and decay, broken only by the sweet, medicinal aroma of crushed wild mint. Occasionally, Skylar would murmur notes into her phone about plot arrangements or peculiar carvings, quietly filling her data folder for later. It was 3 hours in and nearly dusk when she found it. The smallest, most isolated grave in the oldest section. The marker was of local granite. Unlike the others, it bore no name, only a carved image. A skull, deeply incised, but facing away from the path, turned toward the earth itself. The face of the stone, the front, was blank. Only by circling it did Skylar see the carving pointing resolutely toward the woods. She felt a prickle at the base of her neck. Centuries of symbolic language for death. But this was different. Deliberate, almost defiant. She crouched beside the marker, photographing every angle, and began to dig in the soft dirt at the stone's base. Not a grave robbing, but a careful scraping to search for historical artifacts undisturbed by centuries. About 2 inches down, her trowel hit something solid. She uncovered, embedded directly beneath the skull, a piece of pottery bearing the outline of a bird and a handful of hairpins, twisted and blackened, but still strong with the memory of their owner. Curiosity turned scholarly. Skylar documented her find and returned the earth to its place. She consulted her field notes, recalling that local folklore had once blamed the region for witchcraft. The documentation was sparse. Stories of women who had brought the rot to crops, livestock deaths, children's illnesses, all attributed to malice made manifest. Centuries earlier, accusations of witchcraft had traveled with settlers from Europe, finding new scapegoats in the New World. The light faded completely while Skylar worked, and she found herself lingering near the reversed skull. Her phone buzzed, the battery waning. She packed her bag, cast one last look at the stone, and started down the path. She had not gone far before she realized she'd left her camera behind, sitting by the strange marker. She retraced her steps, growing uneasy as the woods seemed to swallow the last bits of daylight. At the grave, the silence pressed in on her from all sides. As Skylar reached for her camera, a shift in the air made her freeze. From a distance behind her, she heard the unmistakable crack of a twig, a small sound, but amplified by her isolation. She turned, scanning the darkness. Her light illuminated only a riot of branches and the suggestion of another old stone, its inscription obliterated by moss. The moment stretched, the air thick with ancient expectation. Skylar forced herself to breathe. She gathered her composure and began to walk again, this time not caring that grass clung wetly to her jeans, that thorns scratched her skin, that she was trespassing on some intangible threshold. She only paused once, and then only because the wind seemed to twist around her, bringing with it a whispering that was not quite words, but something close, something pleading. She left the graveyard in darkness, driving the hour home with hands shaking, her camera on the seat beside her. That night, Skylar barely slept, haunted by the sense of having been marked by her encounter. Her dreams swirled with images from her research, skulls and birds, hairpins blackened by time, stones rotating under unseen hands. The next day, Skylar returned to her research. She combed local archives, digital manuscripts, and town records. She located a single newspaper article from 1822 describing the death of a woman called Adeline, buried with face to the earth in accordance with the superstition of those who called her witch. Skylar pieced together timelines, tracing generations of misfortune for the families associated with the grave's vicinity. Unexplained accidents, livestock deaths, fires. Townsfolk whispered about the Witch of Blackwood, whose grave must never face the dawn lest she return. The graves nearby, Skylar noted, all faced east. Only this one defied the rising sun. Days later, she returned to the site, determined to document the stone's orientation more precisely. This time she brought a compass, measuring from the edge of the marker to the cardinal points. As she worked, an older woman approached along the path, walking with careful steps and a heavy wooden cane. "You are documenting old Adeline's grave," the woman observed. "My grandmother always told me she cursed those who disturbed her rest. The stone, it is turned to warn the living not to look back." Schuyler introduced herself, careful to present her purpose as respectful. The woman, Mrs. Carlyle, nodded and told Schuyler stories passed down through her family. Dreams about Adeline's face, storms following the disturbance of the grave, the way children, when dared, found themselves ill for days after touching the marker. Schuyler asked if the stories were believed. Mrs. Carlyle shrugged. "Belief is a strange thing. When storms killed our crops last year, some blamed Adeline again. But the world has changed. We pay our debts in memory now, not fear. It is enough to keep her grave turned." She handed Schuyler a small cloth bundle. Inside, 3 white feathers, a symbol of protection in old folk ways. That night, Schuyler entered her notes and spent hours reviewing her photographs. The image of the skull, carved to face west and down, unsettled her in ways she could not explain to anyone outside her field. The intent was not to keep the dead from returning, but to force her to look only inward, never again to see the world. A form of punishment and, perhaps, a weapon. The anthropologist in Schuyler documented. The human wondered. A week later, the local historical society approached Schuyler to assist in a restoration of the oldest graves. She recommended they preserve the skull marker exactly as it was, warning them of the tales and local customs she had learned. Though she shared her research, she kept her deeper unease to herself. In the days that followed, those involved in the project reported mishaps, minor car accidents, tools vanishing, animals found dead in the road near the cemetery gate. When word spread, a few older residents insisted that the stone must not be moved, that to rotate it or remove it would bring back old troubles. Bowing to local sentiment, the restoration preserved the grave as it was, unmarked and unaltered. Schuyler was invited to speak about her findings at the Regional Historical Conference. Her talk, Orientation, Ostracism, and the Social Control of Women in Early Rural Cemeteries, was well received. But she noticed a distinct chill when she described the legend of Adeline. A few local children in attendance wouldn't meet her eyes. One left the room, pale and shivering. Yet science demanded closure, and on her last visit before publishing her thesis, Schuyler returned to Blackwood. While photographing, she noticed a new circle of small stones carefully arranged at the grave's west-facing edge. An act of quiet preservation or warning, she could not be sure. She left a feather from Mrs. Carlyle's bundle, compelled by custom and gratitude, and promised herself she would respect the town's mysteries. But that night, as thunder swept over her house and wind battered her windows, Schuyler dreamed she stood again behind the reversed skull, staring into blank stone until, at last, something in the dark turned to face her. She awoke gasping, her mind rational, yet her body trembling with a fear centuries old and impossible to explain. People who spoke with Schuyler afterward recalled that she remained changed, more curious yet more careful, as though she had glimpsed a warning meant for all who think the past is silent. In the library archives, her field notes are preserved, alongside a single grayscale image of a skull that does not look at the living, but listens eternally to the restless earth. Aaron always felt drawn to places where records did not quite add up. As a genealogist and amateur historian, he considered discrepancies a personal challenge, a puzzle begging to be solved. His interest in cemeteries was not rooted in morbidity, but in the untold stories, the names half remembered, the dates that vanished in official archives. Most of his research focused on missing persons or family lines interrupted by incomprehensible tragedy. So when a local historical society flagged a set of death records at Riverside Cemetery with identical causes spanning a 5-year window, Aaron's curiosity became a calling. Riverside Cemetery lay on the outskirts of a worn New England town, bordered by an old iron fence and accessible via a narrow, cracked lane. Its main entrance boasted a chipped arch of stone, the year 1855 still visible in the keystone. Aaron's first visit was on a sodden afternoon in autumn. He carried his notebook, field recorder, and a battered briefcase with a copy of the cemetery's partial map, hastily photocopied from yellowed archives the night before. The investigation began with numbers. From 1960 to 1965, death records from Riverside listed 23 individuals from the same neighborhood as having died from sudden illness. Their ages ranged from 7 months to 81 years. All were buried in a cluster near the cemetery's northeast quadrant, the oldest part of the grounds. The official record stopped there. No autopsy notes, no explanatory letters for the relatives. To Aaron, sudden illness was not an explanation, but an omission. He started by reading every grave marker, matching names and dates with public records in a slow, deliberate process. He cross-referenced death certificates, referencing city directories, family Bibles when he could find them, and the brittle minutes of city council meetings. Most importantly, he interviewed surviving relatives. Some remembered little. Most were children at the time, and the deaths had faded into family legend. Grandparents lost to bad luck, children gone without warning. But when Aaron probed deeper, he discovered that these families had lived on the same street in houses built in the late 1940s as part of a post-war housing boom. It was here, as he mapped out each relative's original address, that the odd pattern became painfully clear. The houses were clustered around the site of a chemical spill, one that was never properly cleaned by the manufacturing company responsible. The more Aaron learned, the more he realized this was less a cluster of coincidental tragedy than the aftermath of a cover-up. Aaron re-examined the graves. Some had fresh flowers, polyester thread faded beneath the sun, left by descendants who had never learned the truth. Others were marked only by the scrawl of time, stones sinking into the soil, names lost to lichen and rain. He took detailed photos of each, setting out to build a case that could catch the attention of forensic researchers and environmental historians alike. The break came through interviews with the town's oldest residents. An elderly man named Frank, whose sister had died in the same period, agreed to talk. Frank, stooped but shrewd, remembered rumors from childhood. Strange men in unmarked vans, pets dying suddenly, water that turned the color of rust. He recalled the fear that children would fall ill if they played near the creek, a warning parents repeated but never explained. Frank's narrative, corroborated by a handful of surviving neighbors, gave Aaron a map of the time. The chemical spill, the denials of local government, the hurried burials. With enough circumstantial evidence, Aaron took the investigation to the state's medical examiner office. He requested permission to exhume several of the bodies for new autopsies, citing both public safety and historical integrity. The process was complicated and met with resistance from cemetery officials and some family members, troubled by the idea of disturbing their ancestors' rest. But after months of paperwork and negotiation, the permits were granted for 7 exhumations. The exhumation day arrived on a gray, windless morning. Technicians in standard coveralls brought scientific equipment, and a small crowd of townspeople gathered out of morbid curiosity. Aaron felt the weight of responsibility. These families, these histories, relied on careful work and respectful hands. As the graves were opened, Aaron and the forensics team took samples: hair, nails, bone, and soil. The lab results, weeks later, confirmed what Aaron suspected and feared. Significant levels of extremely toxic substances, mercury, arsenic, and dioxin, all byproducts of the chemical plant, were found in multiple bodies. The conclusion was irrefutable. These people had died from repeated environmental poisoning, not natural causes. More troubling still, several bodies showed signs of exposure in the months leading to death, meaning the contamination had been ongoing, not a single event. The confirmation of homicide by poison reached the state attorney general's office. Litigation began against the now defunct chemical manufacturer, which had been swallowed up decades earlier by a multinational conglomerate. Investigators pored over old records, unearthed letters, and depositions. It became a battle not only for accountability, but for recognition. The right of families to know, at last, why so many of their members died before their time. As the investigation progressed in public view, Aaron became the reluctant spokesman for a slow-burning tragedy. He was interviewed by newspapers, appeared on regional news, and led historical tours through the cemetery, mapping out the story for curious visitors. Some accused him of stirring up trouble, of desecrating the dead for fame. Others thanked him for the truth, however bitter. But it was not over. When Aaron scanned through cemetery records for further clues, he found several other clusters. People who had died from unnamed illnesses, always after a local event. A pesticide trial, a new treatment plant, a flood. He realized these events were not isolated, but instead threads in a vast, dark tapestry of local history. As winter arrived, Aaron made regular visits to Riverside Cemetery. One morning, after a cycle of freezing rain, he noticed someone had placed fresh flowers at the plot of a young boy named Samuel, who had died in 1962. Aaron met the mourner, a woman, Samuel's younger sister, who explained in halting words that her mother had never forgiven herself for letting her son play near the polluted creek. "The pain never goes away," she told Aaron, "but now I know it was not our fault." Aaron's research made one final, haunting discovery. 2 graves inside the same poisoned cluster contained no remains, only stones and, chillingly, 2 empty coffins buried in haste. The cemetery record simply read, "Unidentified, presumed child." Family interviews and city birth records suggested these were the bodies of children who had gone missing during floods and whose remains were never formally identified. They had been presumed dead and given symbolic burials by families desperate for closure. Late at night, Aaron found himself dreaming of the cemetery. In dreams, he walked the rows of poisoned earth, the tombstones whispering secrets as wind stirred the decaying leaves. Sometimes, he would hear voices, children's laughter, the cries of mourning mothers, chants for justice. He awoke each morning exhausted, weighed down by the enormity of truth and the impossibility of returning the dead to life or restoring to the living the peace they had been denied. Despite the closure brought by identification, the investigation became a wedge in the community. Lawsuits against the chemical company divided the town, some arguing that the living deserved restitution, others desperate to protect the legacy of a now defunct employer that had once provided livelihoods for generations. Aaron watched as neighbors stopped speaking, as old friendships were eclipsed by bitterness exposed by long-buried truths. Yet still he worked, determined that history could not be allowed to close over the scars. His office filled with letters and family Bibles, photographs of the lost, and thank you cards from people who never knew they needed what he had uncovered. In the spring, the town dedicated a new memorial at Riverside. 7 granite stones for the identified victims of the poisoning, engraved with names, birth and death dates, and a short inscription: "Let truth be told. Let memory serve." Aaron spoke at the dedication, his words measured and clear, even as tears welled. He told the crowd that memory alone was not enough, that justice required acknowledgement as well as remembrance. That night, alone beside the memorial, Aaron looked up at the sky and listened to the wind moving through the trees. He felt hope, mourning, and responsibility intermixed, a legacy carried forward by the living on behalf of the dead. Still, the cemetery held secrets. One day, while walking the furthest edge near the old iron fence, Aaron tripped on a half-buried stone. When he unearthed it, he found a child's shoe and a rusted locket. Inside the locket was a photograph so faded as to be almost ghostly, an image of a young boy standing by the same iron fence, sunlight in his hair. Aaron filed the locket in the town archives, and the photograph became both a riddle and a benediction. Who the boy was, and whether he was claimed or lost, could not yet be known. But Aaron understood that his search was not for closure, but continuation. That cemeteries are not merely final chapters, but open books, the stories within always waiting for someone willing to listen. Hazel considered solitude part of the job description. Night groundskeeper at Crescent Hill Cemetery did not appeal to most people, much less to anyone with a taste for comfort or routine. But Hazel had grown accustomed to, perhaps even dependent on, the rhythm of silence broken only by the crunch of her boots on gravel and the shiver of wind through ancient maples. The world beyond her jurisdiction faded at night. All that existed was the patterned geometry of headstones stretching across the hill and the ceaseless ticking of her watch. Some might say Hazel was running from her past. She would have said she preferred the company of the dead to the unpredictable living. The cemetery's office was a squat brick building set just inside the main gate, glowing yellow from within while the rest of the world slept. Crescent Hill itself sprawled for nearly 40 acres atop an ancient slope, visible from much of the old city below. Its stones ranged from simple nameless slabs, sunken and lichen-riddled, to elaborate marble obelisks engraved with ornate Victorian script. Hazel's desk bore registers, handwritten and digital, mapping every plot, every interred body, every unexplained disturbance. Hazel took her job seriously. Nightly patrols, logging weather and incidents, changing bulbs in the motion lights, clearing any fallen branches from the graveled lanes. Like many cemeteries with a past, Crescent Hill was no stranger to trespassers. During her first weeks on the job, teenagers had attempted midnight dares among the tombs, local ghost hunters had peppered the main office porch with questions, and would-be vandals had left cryptic symbols on the southern wall. But by her third year, her presence was enough to ward off nearly anyone seeking ordinary trouble. Then, the footsteps began. The first night Hazel heard them was a Tuesday in late November. The air was sharp and crystalline, stars visible above the cemetery in an unbroken sweep. She sat at her desk, sipping black coffee, updating the incident log. When the office's aging intercom crackled, the motion detector had triggered at the main entrance. Checking the camera feed, Hazel saw nothing but moonlit frost on the gate and silent, empty drive. She reset the alert. It sounded again at 2:47 a.m. exactly. This time, she switched live to the gate's CCTV camera and watched, breath held, as a lone figure moved through the entrance. Tall, wrapped in a long coat, the visitor gave no glance to the office or the camera, but seemed to know the path intimately, never hesitating or stumbling as he crossed the main thoroughfare toward the oldest part of the graveyard. Hazel watched for a minute, then two, paralyzed by the incongruity of the scene. Her instincts warred. Protocol demanded intervention, but something deeper advised caution. She called out, "Hello?" over the speaker, her voice flat in the grainy darkness. No response from the man, if man it was, whose face never showed in the camera's limited field. By the time Hazel reached the main drive with her flashlight, the cemetery was silent, the frost still unbroken. This pattern repeated itself over the coming weeks. Every night at precisely 2:47 a.m., the motion detector triggered, always at the main gate. Always the same figure, always the same route toward the northwest quadrant. Hazel documented each occurrence, the time, the weather conditions, the path taken. She grew increasingly unsettled by the methodical perfection. No footprints marked the frost after the figure passed. No doorways were left open for her to lock. She tried walking the route at 2:40, standing watch among the graves, but the visitor never appeared when she waited outside. Always, the camera showed the passage. Never when she was once more at her desk, watching from behind glass. Hazel tried to rationalize. A trick of the cold, the mind playing games with routine. A regular trespasser with knowledge of the cameras. She scanned through months of old footage, but the 2:47 mark yielded nothing until that November when the figure appeared. The city police were sympathetic but uninvested. They suggested local kids with elaborate pranks, or maybe a homeless wanderer with a taste for ritual. Hazel did not believe in ghosts, but she believed in patterns, and she knew the living, not the dead, were ultimately the more dangerous. She attempted to break the cycle. For 3 nights, Hazel unplugged the main gate camera. Each time, the office lights flickered at 2:47, a strange power surge in an otherwise robust circuit. One night, her laptop crashed precisely at the minute the routine should have unfolded. When it restarted, the system log showed no memory usage for the missing interval. Desperate for answers, Hazel delved into cemetery records, poring over plot maps and incident reports dating back to 1924. She discovered something chilling. The grave toward which the visitor always headed belonged to a man named Charles Addison, interred December 21, 1989. The file contained a faded newspaper clipping, a story of a fatal car accident at 2:47 a.m. The driver had never been recovered. Only personal effects and partial remains had been found, enough for a symbolic burial. The record noted, "Body not recovered. Grave established at family's request." Hazel found photographs of the funeral, a grieving wife in a black veil, a young son clutching a white rose, a casket lowered into frost-bound earth. Hazel's rational mind constructed explanations. Perhaps a relative performed nightly visits in memory. But the city's birth and death registries revealed no living descendants, and the cemetery's mailing list, used for annual notifications, marked Charles Addison's family as relocated, contact unknown. That week, Hazel began to notice changes in the air. At 2:47, the world felt altered. Sound thinned, the temperature dipped, the shadows grew sharper. The lights in the office dimmed imperceptibly, and the hands of her watch seemed to tremble. Her cat, a stray she'd taken in during her first winter, hid every night at the stroke of that minute, refusing to emerge until nearly 3. Determined to test her perceptions, Hazel set up an old tape recorder by Addison's grave, hoping to capture what? Voices, footsteps, the whisper of something unaccounted for. Each night, the recorder picked up only wind and, once, a faint humming, like a song remembered in pieces. She left small offerings, a pebble, a flower, a note with the words, "Who are you?" but nothing ever changed at the gravesite. The frost was never broken, the ground never stirred. Yet, Hazel could not shake the sense that this routine was not about her or even about Addison's grave, but about the hour itself. What did 2:47 a.m. mean? Was it the moment of death, the return of a loop, the folding back of time upon itself? She began to mark each passing night with detailed notes. Wind still in the elms, cat under desk, light stutters, odor of rain, though it has not rained in days, feeling of pressure behind the eyes. In January, the incidents escalated. On the 13th, Hazel returned from her rounds to find the office cold as a tomb. Her coffee had spilled, though she'd left it undisturbed, and the chair was pushed back from the desk at an odd angle. Her logbook, habitually left open, was closed, a single fingerprint pressed into the dust nearby. Long, thin, as though made by a hand from another era. On the 16th, Hazel followed the route she'd mapped on her patrol. But at the north fence, she found the gate open for the first time. The air beyond was thick with fog. She stepped through, heart racing, scanning for footprints. Her flashlight danced over the high grass, glinting off a silver locket half buried under a stone. Hazel pocketed it, intending to catalog the artifact. But chills coursed her spine when, back at the office, she discovered initials engraved on the back. C.A. Charles Addison. That night, she carried the locket to the grave and set it on the headstone just before 2:47. The air pulsed. She felt it in her bones, a vibration too deep for sound. The frost swirled and settled, a new layer of ice forming as though in answer to her offering. When the clock marked the fateful minute, Hazel stood silent amid the tombs, her breath hanging like ghost words in the air. Suddenly, she saw him. Not through the camera, not on a screen, but in the world. A tall figure in the long coat, stepping soundlessly between the stones. The visitor paused at Addison's grave, not turning. Yet Hazel felt his awareness reach her, an almost mutual acknowledgement. The cold deepened around her. The world seemed to narrow to that plot, that minute. Hazel's legs went weak, but she stood, head bowed, refusing to flee. The figure knelt, placed one hand over the locket, and whispered words Hazel could not hear but felt. Gratitude, grief, relief. Then, as the clock's minute hand moved past 2:48, the figure faded, not vanishing abruptly, but dwindling as fog dissolves at dawn. After that night, Crescent Hill changed. The nightly 2:47 disturbance never returned. Hazel kept the footage, the log entries, and the locket, which she found back at her desk the next morning, cold as the grave, but dry. She wore it as a charm, unsure if she acted out of superstition or reluctant respect. In time, Hazel shared her experiences with a fellow groundskeeper, a friend named Paisley, who split the shift on weekends. Paisley did not scoff, but listened carefully, then recounted tales of her own. Strange footprints seen in snowfall, lamps flickering dim blue, the feeling of invisible eyes at her back. Hazel became Crescent Hill's unofficial historian. She cataloged every unusual event, ghostly or merely odd, leaving careful records for her successors. She installed new cameras with clearer lenses, updated the system to keep full logs, and made sure to report even the smallest anomaly in the incident book. Residents and families noticed the change, claiming the cemetery now felt more peaceful, less charged, the air lighter, as if something long bound had finally been set free. Hazel never sought publicity, never shared her story on ghost hunter forums or with journalists seeking true tales of the haunted night. Still, when new employees asked about Crescent Hill's oddest legend, she only cautioned, "Respect the hour. Some visitors do not come for the living." Years later, after Hazel retired, the midnight visitor became local legend, a tale whispered among new staff on stormy nights, a warning to respect the boundaries between duty, the living, and the presence of those who, for reasons knowable only at the edge of time, return for a ritual, a memory, or unfinished grief. Thomas believed that history was truth, but as caretaker of the Ash Grove family cemetery, he often doubted whose truth the land actually remembered. Most people in Ash Grove County saw the old burial hill as a place of trees and memories, a place to honor the dead and let the past rest. For Thomas, whose family had tended the graves for 5 generations, cemeteries were more than silence and ritual. They were archives of secrets, betrayals, and confessions written in the language of stone and soil. He never imagined he would become the keeper of one confession that refused to stay buried. Ash Grove Cemetery was old, even by local standards. The oldest graves, slate tablets eroded to anonymous gray slabs, stood in a southeast corner beneath sagging pine. Each year, weather and time claimed more of their surfaces, erasing names but never the presence of the residents beneath. Thomas spent every autumn clearing leaves, mending the wrought iron fence, cataloging each stone in a battered leather journal first kept by his great-great-uncle, Abraham Sanford. His routine stayed unbroken for years, until winter fell, and the chain on the west gate snapped in a storm. As Thomas patrolled the untouched section, where newer family members had been laid to rest in recent decades, his flashlight caught something strange on a crooked stone that leaned outward from the hillside. It was a simple marker, tall and narrow, with the family name Weatherly on the face and birth and death dates, 1873, 1931. What stopped Thomas was not the name, but the invisible thread of oddness tugging at his subconscious. He brushed away a lattice of ivy, revealing a fine seam where the back of the grave appeared slightly separated from the main stone. Puzzled, Thomas circled the marker, never expecting to find what he did. Carved into the back, hidden from view for almost a century, was an inscription, shallow but legible. It read, "I am not buried here. I am hiding. T.W., 1931. A chill crept down his spine, the freezing wind biting at his jacket. Thomas traced the message once, not daring to let his fingers linger. It was as though someone had pressed the truth directly into the stone, certain no living soul would read it. That night, Thomas found sleep impossible. He lay awake in his grandfather's old house by the edge of the cemetery, replaying the moment he touched the inscription. I am hiding. Was it a joke, a desperate plea, or something darker? The next morning, over black coffee, he searched the Sanford journals, flipping through brittle, yellowed pages for mention of T.W. or any rumor about the Weatherly plot. His grandfather's entries offered little beyond routine notes about burials and an odd warning from 1932. Sanford Sr. had written, "Do not investigate the Weatherly inscription. Some stones conceal what the living cannot bear. Let it rest." The words inked in looping cursive haunted Thomas. He resolved, against the advice of the Yao ancestors, to learn more. Weeks went by. Snow layered the graves in thick drifts. Thomas's research at the town library yielded only the basics. Timothy Weatherly disappeared in June of 1931, never found, presumed dead. His burial was a formal affair, a closed coffin attended by the county's most prominent families. The newspaper suggested he had been killed en route to his trial for the murder of a local merchant, but no body was ever produced. The consensus among townsfolk was simple. Timothy had skipped town, vanishing rather than facing justice. Yet, Thomas's academic instincts pressed for evidence. Why would a stone be left with such a message? Inward, secret, for no audience other than the earth. He questioned town elders, collecting half-truths and rumors. Some claimed the Weatherly family buried stones to confound spirits, a superstition from Old England. Others whispered that Timothy's body was hidden nearby, never recovered. More than one elder insisted on the family's guilt, citing strange happenings in the cemetery at night. Whispers, the sound of digging, a figure seen wandering near the Weatherly plot in the winter fog. The deeper Thomas dug, the more he noticed how the air near the markers seemed unnaturally cold. Animals avoided the area. Grass grew in patchy tufts, and strange, formless indentations sometimes appeared in the snow, as if something pressed upward from below in the dead of night. Thomas began a routine patrol, circling the Weatherly plot every night, sometimes in mist, sometimes beneath a sky thick with stars. Each time, he felt watched by the dead, or perhaps by some remnant of the confession stone's restless spirit. Historians in the county court let Thomas review sealed property records from 1931. There he found astonishing detail, unread by most. Timothy Weatherly had not only been a suspect in the merchant's murder, but also a whistleblower who had threatened to reveal a smuggling ring run by leading figures in the county. His disappearance predated the bodies of two other men found upriver, both rumored to have died running their mouths. The Weatherly letter, reportedly penned from jail, was never released, sealed in evidence. The case, officially solved, was quietly forgotten. As winter turned to spring, Thomas spoke with Hazel, an old friend who studied regional folklore and haunted places. Hazel listened as Thomas recounted what he had found, the confession, the strange events by the grave, the patterns of death and silence surrounding the Weatherly name. She suggested that Thomas record everything, down to the smallest detail, as a way of separating fact from suggestion. Together, the two began recording sounds near the plot, especially at night. The first week, all was still. Wind, branches creaking, snow melting. The second week, they captured faint tapping, distant footsteps, and once, the distinct sound of low, male laughter. Hazel grew uneasy, reluctant to continue after her recorder picked up her own name, spoken softly in the dark, though no one else was present. Tension in Thomas's life mounted. In town, people grew wary of his questions. Someone left a dead crow on his porch, a note tucked under its wing. Dead men tell no tales, nor caretakers. The local historical board discouraged further probing of the Weatherly records. Undaunted, Thomas continued, convinced that history demanded truth, even if no one in the living community cared to hear it. He contacted a forensic geologist from the university, who agreed to test the soil around the Weatherly plot for signs of tampering. The report revealed traces of disturbed ground as recently as the 1980s, but nothing deeper. No evidence of a recent, clandestine burial. A ground-penetrating radar survey hinted at a hollow beneath the grave, a small rectangular void that did not match any official records. It could be an old vault, or it could be nothing. Thomas resolved to wait until the anniversary of the disappearance to see if anything returned. On the 89th anniversary of Timothy's vanishing, Thomas held vigil at the Weatherly Stone, surrounded by flickering lanterns, the night air thick with coming rain. Midnight passed, heavy and expectant. At 2:00 a.m., Thomas heard the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on gravel. A shadow detached itself from the gloom, lingering near the confession stone. Heart thundering, Thomas called out for the visitor to show himself, voice echoing among the stones. A figure materialized, a man of indistinct features, built like the Weatherly men in the old portraits. He appeared both there and not there, the outline of longing and regret woven through rain and half light. The man nodded at Thomas, then knelt before the stone, pressing his forehead to the earth. With a shudder of cold, wind whipped through the trees, carrying the words not written, but nonetheless inscribed. Do not forget me. Not all who are accused are guilty. Light dawned through clouds. The apparition faded, and Thomas found the grass pressed flat where the figure had knelt, moistened with tears or rain or both. He pressed his palm to the stone, swearing to record the story, no matter the cost. In the months that followed, Thomas published his research and his journals in the county paper. Though some dismissed it as fancy, others came forward. Descendants, neighbors, secret witnesses, ready to tell their family tales. Several long-lost letters emerged, confirming Timothy Weatherly's innocence. He had been set up, marked for death, and buried in silence because powerful men believed some truths should stay hidden forever. The confession stone stood as a mark of that injustice. Thomas's writing changed how locals viewed the cemetery, a place not just of endings, but of questions demanding answers. Visitors made pilgrimages to the Weatherly plot, leaving flowers, feathers, and handwritten notes. A teacher brought his class to learn that sometimes history must be brave enough to speak for the voiceless. Thomas, watcher on the hill, became a legend in his own right. Some said he talked to the ghosts, others that he had inherited old curses. He aged, but never lost the habit of patrolling by lantern, keeping vigil for the restless or the wrongly accused. The confession stone, scarred by weather and time, remained upright, its message fading only as the truth took root in living memory. Near the stone, each spring, wild violets blossomed where no hand had planted them, their petals a secret signal between the living and the hidden. Thomas believed it was Timothy's way of saying thank you, a final confession of hope beneath the weight of rooted earth. And so the Ash Grove Cemetery endured, carrying its stories forward so that no grave, no secret, and no wronged name would ever be buried in silence again.